Mike, his background before he came to, before he started working was he studied at McGill and received 2 degrees in biology, spent a year at the National Taiwan University studying Chinese, was at MIT for a master's degree in city planning, and is getting pretty ready to leave school. But before he came, actually, he worked for 5 years with the United Nations and spent some of that time in Africa. In fact, spent a year with the Kenyan government. And another fascinating thing about Mike's background is that he was inspired to be interested in African land use issues because his grandparents were in service with in East Africa with the Royal Engineers. Mike's a Commonwealth guy. So anyway, when we let him go, if we let him go, he's going to join the faculty at Harvard. So
thank you very much, Mike. Thanks very much, Len.
Let me get my, yeah.
Well, thank you for coming today. I'm very excited to be able to speak about my dissertation research, which is on the dynamics and consequences of slum dweller mobilization around urban evictions in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. My research actually addresses 2 related questions, and I'll be addressing each of these in turn in today's presentation. And the first is, what motivates slum dweller participation in urban social movements, particularly around urban evictions? And second, does social capital gained through social movement participation influence post-eviction resettlement success? So before speaking about my project in more detail, I'd like to just give you a sense of the project background. And perhaps I should begin by describing how I became interested in this topic. And when I was in East Africa working with the UN, I became aware of the tremendous role that grassroots groups, and particularly slum dweller organizations, were having both on urban politics and on development policy. So in order to understand this phenomenon in greater detail, I wanted to pursue it in the context of a PhD. And to that end, I conducted 2 years of interviews with slum dwellers in Dar es Salaam between 2007 and 2009. And in particular, I looked at participation in the Tanzania Federation of the Urban Poor, or TFUP. And the TFUP movement is the National Slum Dweller Organization of Tanzania. And it's based around a network of savings groups through which members can both take out loans and undertake savings, but it also has strong movement dimensions and is involved in political mobilization around land use and housing. And at the international level, TFUP is associated with Slum Dwellers International, or SDI, with which some of you might be familiar. It's an international slum dweller network. And the community I was working in, Kurasini, is a ward of the city of Dar es Salaam, and it's unplanned informal settlement of approximately 35,000 people, built in the interstices of the port of Dar es Salaam. And evictions took place there in late 2007, early 2008, to expand the fuel storage capacity of the port. And just to give you a sense of the geographical setting for this work, you can see the country of Tanzania highlighted in orange on the top left. And on the top right, you see the city of Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean coast in East Africa. And in this bottom image, you see, in the satellite image, you can see this dense area of settlement amongst these larger buildings. That is the port infrastructure. And as I mentioned, Kurasini is a slum built within the actual infrastructure of the port of the city. So just to reiterate, the first question I'll be talking about today is, what motivates slum dweller participation in urban social movements? In other words, who participates and why? Now, this question might seem somewhat esoteric at first glance, but I think there's a number of reasons why it's important. And first, there's growing attention on participatory and bottom-up approaches to development, both in urban planning and in international development. And in the face of low government capacity to deliver on development outcomes in the developing world, there's tremendous hope placed on grassroots social movements and grassroots organizations that they might be able to deliver where governments have been unable. And this increasing attention on participation and bottom-up approaches to development is in many respects positive, but it builds on a tacit assumption that the poor will participate. And we know from our own communities and the lives around us, we know that not everybody engages in collective action in our own communities. So to really understand the dynamics of participation at this level, it's important to understand who does engage and why. And I mentioned I'm interested in participation in social movement activities, but I'm particularly interested in this case in participation in enumerations. And this is in the first question. And enumerations are geographical and population censuses of at-risk communities undertaken by communities themselves. And participation in enumerations, that is, as an enumerator, is a very strong measure of committed social movement participation because they're physically and politically risky, and they involve tremendous contributions of time. So it's a good measure of committed participation in a movement, more so than, let's say, attendance at meetings or other sort of tacit forms or non-costly forms of participation. And the broad goal of enumerations is to generate data on marginalized communities, to give them a face, to give them the sort of potential for political mobilization, and to demonstrate to government that they have the capacity for mobilization, and to effectively lobby government for policy change in the community's interest. And in this particular case, in Kurasini, the goal was, recognizing that the eviction would take place, to lobby government for a grant of land on which the community could be resettled. So that was the goal in Kurasini. And I should say that enumerations as a form of mobilization are increasingly widely used by slum dweller organizations and the poor in the developing world. And that increases the likelihood that these results from this study will be broadly applicable, or more broadly applicable than to the single case. And another factor increasing the applicability of these results is that the forces reshaping Dar es Salaam, and particularly a demand for marginal land within the city for development, and as it happens, that marginal land happens to be where the poor so often reside, is a force that's not only reshaping Dar es Salaam, but many developing world cities, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, that increases the expectation that the results from this study will be more broadly applicable. So interestingly, the movement organizers, TFUP movement organizers, had a very strong working hypothesis about what motivated members to participate as enumerators. That is, stand out from the general membership and engage in these costly social movement activities. And that hypothesis was based on the idea of payoffs. And recognizing that in evictions in Tanzania, owners are compensated at a de minimis level for lost property, and renters are not, movement organizers had said, in the event of a successful enumeration outcome in the form of a grant of land, that would go to renters first because they aren't compensated. So effectively, the movement organizers said, payoffs matter. Because they'd structured the payoffs to go to renters, they expected to see renters dominating in the ranks of enumerators. So this is an interesting working hypothesis and a good jumping off point for a deeper investigation of the factors motivating social movement participation. So just before getting into the research, the formal research approach and results, I'd just like to give you an aesthetic sense of what an enumeration looks like. And here you have two members of the Federation of the Urban Poor who have volunteered as enumerators. And the woman in the blue smock is interviewing two household members, getting that census data on household size, household incomes, occupation types. And the gentleman on the right is recording a reference number on a settlement door. And this reference number will be recorded on a community-generated map that will go alongside the database of census, more demographic information. And here are two gentlemen undertaking measurement activities, recording the size of each house and parcel. And that data will be recorded both on that community-generated map and will be entered into the database of quantitative information coming out of the census. So the research approach that I adopted in the study, both for the first and second questions, was that of an analytic narrative, effectively combining formal hypothesis testing with detailed analysis of interview transcripts. And as this methodology was applied here, the formal hypotheses serve to identify patterns in the quantitative data that can then be dug into and explored in more nuanced detail using this extensive body of qualitative data coming out of interviews with community members. And for both questions, I interviewed a total of 102 slum dwellers. For this first question, it addresses or draws upon data from 81 of these interviews with 81 of these individuals, all of whom were members of the Federation of the Urban Poor, half of whom volunteered as enumerators and half did not. And I interviewed all members of the movement who participated as enumerators and a random sample of members who did not. So for this first question, I actually tested 6 formal hypotheses. but I'll only discuss 3 of these today, and these are the 3 that yielded statistically significant results. And the predictions and measures for each of these hypotheses was based on a combination of the literature and preliminary fieldwork in Dar es Salaam. And the 3 formal hypotheses I'll talk about today are payoffs, movement identification, and connection to place. And the first 2 were chosen because they relate to a long-standing debate in the social movements literature and social science literature, for that matter, about what motivates participation in collective action. And the third, connection to place, was chosen because this is an idea that's near and dear to the hearts of geographers and urban planners, but is very much under-theorized in the social movement literature, and some would say in the social science literature more broadly. So, turning to each of these hypotheses in order, the argument concerning payoffs is that rational, economically calculative decision-making dominates participation decisions. And the expectation here is based on the logic of the movement itself, as mentioned earlier. And the expectation was that because payoffs have been structured to benefit renters, renters would dominate in the ranks of enumerators. So that is the expectation here. For movement identification, the argument or intuition is that more psychosocial processes dominate participatory decision-making. And the expectation here is that individuals who identify more strongly with the movement will be more likely to participate. And the measure for this hypothesis is response to an open-ended question concerning one's identity. What is your primary identity? And this might seem like a challenging question, but this type of this line of question is increasingly used in the social science literature, for example, in sociology and political science, where there's an increasing interest in the fluidity and utility of identity. And the third hypothesis, connection to place, the expectation is that those who have lived longer in a community or who are more likely to consider it home will be more likely to engage in collective action. And both of the measures, duration of residence and likelihood of considering the community home, were assessed through relevant interview questions posed to interviewees. So I'll deal with each of these 3 hypotheses in order and present results from each. But I'd like to begin with perhaps the most surprising result. And that is that owners were significantly more likely to participate than renters as enumerators. In fact, 90% of all enumerators were owners, not renters, as expected by movement organizers. So, in other words, the movement mobilized a fundamentally different group of people than expected. They'd expect renters to participate. In fact, virtually all participants were owners. So this is a very surprising result. And just as an aside before moving on, I'd just like to say that as I use the word significance in the presentation, I'm talking about statistical significance at the 0.05 level, and all the relationships I'll describe are statistically significant in this sense. So I wanted to dig into this surprising result, this very counterintuitive result given the expectations of movement organizers. And I turned to the qualitative data coming out of these extensive interviews with movement members. And they provide a very compelling reason for why owners were more likely to participate than renters. And interestingly, it also relates to the issue of payoffs. And movement members argued that payoffs matter, but owners and renters have different payoffs. And while renters were expected to participate by movement organizers to secure a grant of land via a successful enumeration outcome, movement members argue that owners actually participated to improve the accuracy of the enumeration, to ultimately influence the compensation process. And movement members argue in their narratives of eviction that because both the compensation process and the enumeration process dealt in measurements of land, it was in owners' interest to ensure that those measurements were accurate, since the measurements would ultimately be conveyed to government as part of the lobbying process. To give you a sense of the sentiment, probably in better words than I can describe, I'll give you a representative quote of an interviewee. Owners participate because they are the people who benefit most. Owners are responsible for the value of their house, and the enumeration secures value. So if we look at these payoffs attributed to owners and renters, we can see why, in theoretical terms, the motivations ascribed to owners would be more likely to lead to participation. And just to reiterate, owners were held by movement members to participate to secure an accurate enumeration, to correctly measure plots and houses, to influence compensation. And renters had been expected by movement organizers to participate to get a successful enumeration in the form of a grant of land. If we look at the payoffs facing owners, you can see that these are more individualized. To really monitor the measuring of your own plot and ensure that that measurement is accurate, you have to participate individually. So those payoffs ascribed to owners are more individualized. They also happen to be shorter term and less politically contingent than the payoffs thought by movement organizers to motivate renters. So in theoretical terms, at least in terms of sort of rational choice theory, we can start to see a reason why owners would have been more likely to participate than renters. So if owners did face generally more positive payoffs than renters from participation, were there other factors which predisposed owners to pursue those payoffs? And the data point to two additional factors that led owners to want to pursue or made owners more likely to pursue their payoffs. And the first is connection to place. And you'll recall that this was another of the formal hypotheses studied in this first question. The quantitative data show that owners had lived for significantly longer in their settlements than renters. They were also more likely to consider the settlement they lived in home than renters. But perhaps most intriguingly, when owners and renters from Kurasini were asked, what is the most pressing challenge in your community? They gave fundamentally different answers. In virtually all cases, in fact in all cases, renters listed a short-term challenge, namely their impending eviction and the demolition of their community. However, for owners, in virtually all cases, owners listed a long-term problem, such as school overcrowding, the quality of roads, access to dispensaries. So owners and renters had significantly different and fundamentally different perceptions of the time horizon of challenges facing their community. And interviewees ascribed this difference to the transience, or the lack of connection to place, of renters. And to give a sense of this sentiment, leave you with a representative quote from an interviewee. Renters, and this is from a renter, renters are seen and see themselves as temporary residents with less responsibility. And the second factor, which interviewees argued motivated owners to pursue those payoffs, was belief in efficacy of action. And interviewed members argued that owners had greater belief that their concerns would be listened to, that they could elicit a response from decision makers, that ultimately that their opinions mattered. And interviewees argued that owners were motivated to have that belief in efficacy of action because of past positive experience in having their concerns listened to, and particularly the fact that they were compensated at that de minimis level by government. To give you a sense of this sentiment, I'll leave you with a representative quote from an interviewee. Most interviewees participate because they have confidence, and their confidence comes from their property. Renters lack this confidence, confidence that their actions will bring returns and benefits because they lack property. So at this point, there appears to be a fairly cohesive storyline emerging, that owners were more likely to participate in these costly social movement activities, namely enumerations, because of their more favorable payoffs, their greater connection to place, and greater belief in efficacy of action. And these empirical results from Kurasini overlap strikingly with a body of generalizable theory coming from the 1970s, which sought to explain, in general terms, how individuals respond to situations of decline. And I'm referring to Hirschman's exit voice loyalty model. And Hirschman argued that there are effectively two options in dealing with the declining performance of a firm, organization, or state. The first option is to exit, effectively leave the scenario, walk away. And the second is to pursue voice, that is, act on one's claims and concerns to change the status quo. And Hirschman argued that two factors lower the cost of pursuing voice over the alternative. And these are belief in efficacy of action gained via past positive experiences, and loyalty. And Hirschman defined loyalty as affinity to a market or organization. But you can see in geographical terms, that's very much akin to connection to place. So there's a very strong overlap between the factors offered by movement members in their interviews about what motivated owner participation and this body of theoretical evidence which sought to explain in general terms why people choose to act on their concerns. And this overlap between empirical and theoretic findings gives us a hope that the motivational factors underlying behavior observed in Corsini has perhaps a behavioral basis or a more behavioral basis and certainly apply to other contexts beyond Corsini. So it gives us some hope that these are more broadly relevant. Now I've left the third formal hypothesis until last, and that is movement identification. And you'll recall, sorry, someone should call. The finding in terms of movement identification is that individuals who are more likely to identify with the movement were less likely to participate. So identification is inversely related to the likelihood of participation. And this is a very challenging finding because in many respects, vocal identification with the movement is the simplest and most intuitive measure or means of assessing who is committed and likely to engage in social movement activities. In this case, identification inversely associated with participation. So this is, again, a surprising and somewhat challenging finding, certainly from the perspective of movement organizers. So to dig into this finding in more detail, I conducted 20 supplementary interviews with local experts on slum dweller politics in Tanzania, including civil society leaders, government officials, and civil society leaders and academics. And their explanation for why identification is inversely related to participation, interestingly, share a common theme. And that is the theme of desperation. And these interviewees argued that movement identification does not reflect greater, in this context, does not reflect greater likelihood of, or greater commitment, or greater likelihood of participation, but rather reflects the desperate circumstances of individuals, and that individuals who are more desperate and more desirous of escaping their socioeconomic circumstances are more likely to identify. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a greater willingness to participate. And in this case, it was renters who were more likely to both identify with the movement and who were less likely to participate. And some, I think already we've seen in this presentation, some examples of why renters would be more desperate. For example, they had lower connection to place. They had lower belief in the efficacy of their action. And capturing this desperation, and I think giving a sense of why these explanations of these supplementary interviewees might have some credibility, I give you a quote from a renter in Tanzania, which really captures this idea of renter desperation. Tenants count for nothing in the whole process. It's assumed they're unimportant to these issues by the city, by owners, and by tenants. So there is, coming out of the qualitative data, a palpable sense of renters' lack of recourse and helplessness. So just to summarize the findings from this first question, payoffs favored owner participation over renters. Owners were motivated to pursue their payoffs due to greater connection to place, greater belief in the efficacy of their action. And these empirical results overlapped with the exit voice loyalty model of Hirschman. And movement identification was inversely related with the likelihood of participation. And in terms of the first question, I think this study presents some policy implications that may be relevant both to decision makers and community organizers. And first, the case shows some of the risks inherent in mobilization. First, the possibility to mobilize unintended groups. And in this study, a fundamentally different group of people was mobilized than expected. Secondly, it highlights the difficulty of assessing who will participate in mobilization of this kind. But I think the research also points to some ways to increase the effectiveness of mobilization. And first, and this sounds very intuitive, is to recognize that not everybody participates. That opportunity to participate alone is not sufficient to engender participation. And this sounds intuitive, but it's not actually reflected generally in development policy on the ground. Secondly, ensure that assumed payoffs are those motivating participation. And in this case, a different set of payoffs was operating than those expected by movement organizers, and as a result, a different group of people participated. And finally, understand cleavages in communities that are relevant for participatory decision making. And in this case, the owner-renter cleavage was fundamental to understanding the participatory dynamic. And it appears that this is more, as mentioned earlier, it appears that this may have validity in other settings, similar settings as well. So to transition to the second question, I show this image of Kurasini after some homes have been demolished. And as you can see, as this alludes to, the eviction and demolition ultimately did take place. And unfortunately, that hoped-for grant of land for resettlement was not realized. So upon eviction, community members were dispersed of their own accord to secure their own homes and jobs. And that takes us to the second question, which, if you recall, was, does social capital gained through movement participation influence post-eviction resettlement success? And just to perhaps provide a refresher, social capital, there's many overlapping definitions of social capital, but perhaps the simplest is that it's the value, the collective value embedded in social networks. And it's thought to accrue through organizational engagement or engagement at civic life. And social capital gained through participation in social movements has been shown in a variety of settings to lead to improved post-mobilization outcomes in a variety of settings, from Nepalese villages to the homeless community in New York. So building on those findings, the hypothesis that guides the second question is that individuals with greater social capital will experience greater post-eviction resettlement success. And just why this question might be important, just to briefly touch on a few points, urban evictions are increasingly common in the developing world. And grassroots mobilization by slum dwellers around urban evictions is also increasingly common. However, in terms of the literature and our understanding of these processes, there's been relatively little work on involuntary urban evictions. And this is particularly the case in the developing world. We know quite a bit about where there has been a considerable amount done on rural evictions and urban evictions in the developed world, but involuntary urban evictions in the developing world are less understood. So this research on the second question jumps into that gap in the literature. And in terms of research design for this second question, I interviewed 64 slum dwellers evicted in the first wave of evictions in Kurasini. And that's from my total pool of 102 interviewees. And I conducted pre- and post-eviction interviews, effectively tracking evictees through the eviction process, from prior to eviction through post-resettlement. And post-eviction interviews took place 6 months after eviction. And the interviewee sample included, from the first wave of evictees, TFUP members who had been evicted, and I interviewed all members of the movement who had been evicted in the first wave, and a random sample of non-members who'd been evicted in the first wave of evictions. And I should say these interviews lasted about 2 hours, both the pre and post eviction interviews. And the dependent variable for the second question is post-eviction resettlement success. And this was assessed on 3 dimensions. The first was housing. And I looked at 3 aspects of housing: physical setting, security of tenure, and cost. And each of these was assessed in terms of whether post-eviction conditions were worse, the same as, or improved upon pre-eviction conditions. The second dimension of post-eviction resettlement success I looked at was employment conditions. And I looked at 5 aspects of employment: hours of work, status, security, pay, and travel time to work. And each of these, again, was assessed in terms of whether post-eviction conditions were worse than, similar to, or improved upon pre-eviction conditions. And finally, I looked at household income in terms of percent change post versus pre-eviction. Now, the independent variable, as I mentioned, is social capital. And this was assessed in terms of duration of participation in the TFUP movement. And as I mentioned, social capital is seen to develop, or in some perspectives, is seen to develop through engagement in associational life. So a reasonable measure is duration of participation in the TFUP movement. And it's thought to be a particularly strong measure in this case, because for 92% of members, this was their only organizational affiliation. So it's expected that that precludes gaining participation-derived social capital through other organizational affiliations. So I'll get to the formal hypothesis test result shortly. But what I'd like to do first is just describe the variation in the dependent variable, that is resettlement success. And the first and clearest result is that Post-eviction owners and post-eviction renters, that is individuals who resettled as owners or renters, resettled in significantly different zones. Post-eviction renters resettled in a narrow band relatively close to their former homes, whereas post-eviction owners resettled in a much wider band significantly further from their former homes. So individuals who resettled as owners and renters resettled in fundamentally different zones. And in terms of general resettlement outcomes, these contrasted significantly with the expectations of the TFUP movement. For example, a majority of evictees interviewed reported improved post-eviction housing. Now, this is surprising because the movement mobilized almost solely around the expectation of adverse housing impacts. And you might recall that their goal of receiving that grant of land for resettlement was unsuccessful. Despite not gaining that grant of land, a majority of evictees still reported improved post-eviction housing. So this is quite surprising. Conditions were worse for only between a low of 3.1% on the dimension of physical setting of housing to a high of still only 12.5% for cost. So again, the vast majority on every measure reported improved conditions. Most adverse impacts of eviction were in the area of employment, which were reported as worse for a low of 7% for job status to a high of 79% for travel time to work. And finally, there's a tension in the results around household income. A majority reported improved household incomes. However, a majority also reported worsened individual pay. So there's a tension here that I'd like to turn to in a couple of slides from now, but I'll leave it for a few moments. But a tension between a majority reporting increased household income and a majority also reporting decreased individual pay. Now, the formal hypothesis test result showed that for post-eviction owners, longer duration as a member of the TFUP movement was significantly related to worse employment outcomes in terms of hours, status, and pay. So again, this is an unexpected result in that the more post-eviction owners, at least, were involved in the movement, the worse their outcomes in terms of hour, status, and pay in terms of employment. So this is a surprising result from the perspective of theory, which generally holds that social capital derived from participation leads to improved outcomes. So I wanted to dig into this in more detail. And I turned again to the qualitative data coming out of interviewee transcripts. And a very compelling and cohesive argument comes out of interviewees' transcripts. And that is that members premised their mobilization or resettlement strategy, around the rhetoric and strategic focus of the movement. So, for example, before and during eviction, TFUP members were significantly more likely than non-members to say that they expected the movement to be a source of housing assistance upon resettlement. And a majority of members reported that they had expected that assistance in terms of housing from the movement. So just to capture these sentiments, I'll give you several representative quotes. Again, this is sentiments before and during the eviction itself. Through the Federation, I can get a house in the near future. I am expecting to get a house and land from the Federation. The Federation will construct houses. These houses will be given to each member of the Federation. However, after eviction, upon resettlement, no evictees reported having received any assistance in housing from the movement. So there's a stark contrast between the expectations of members around housing assistance and the reality, which is that none reported having received assistance in terms of housing. And the evictees' resettlement narratives document that members, as a result of those expectations, delayed their individual housing searches and ultimately reported having to resettle at relatively further distances from their further homes, based on those expectations of assistance of housing and ultimately deferring their own individual search for housing until late in the resettlement process. I'll give you some representative quotes regarding this. We thought we would get housing from the movement. I have been waiting. Now I've had a difficult time to find my own house and have moved far away. And I heard we would get housing from the Federation, and I thought we'd move to a planned area. Too many people were looking for houses, so it was very difficult to buy something near if you waited. So, strong argument coming out that members premised their resettlement strategy on the rhetoric and strategic approach of the movement, and ultimately delayed their housing searches, and therefore were relegated to relatively distant resettlement sites. And this strategy was particularly challenging for post-eviction owners. And if you'll recall, post-eviction owners and renters resettled in different zones. So a post-eviction owner who was relegated to a relatively further site ended up much farther from their original home, represented by the black dot, than a post-eviction renter who did the same. So this strategy of deferred housing search was particularly challenging for post-eviction owners, given their further zone of resettlement. And you'll recall that it was post-eviction owners who were members who reported those worsened employment outcomes in terms of hours, status, and pay. And the qualitative narratives of evictees also ascribe that deferred housing search as the reason for owners' worsened employment outcomes. So now I'll turn to that puzzle I mentioned earlier about household incomes and individual pay. So just to reiterate, a majority of evictees reported higher household incomes, but lower individual pay. And this tension becomes more understandable when you actually look at the direction of individual pay change for men and women. And for women, for a majority of women, their individual pay post-eviction worsened. Whereas for men, for a majority of men, their individual pay remained the same or improved. And I should say that as an artifact of the TFUP movement historically being a women's organization, and men have been able to join for some time, they still remain in slight dominance in the ranks of members. So in my sample, there was a majority of women. And that explains why there's this tension between a majority of interviewees reporting worsened individual pay, but improved household income. So effectively, the rise in overall household income appears to be driven by the stability and increase in male pay, whereas behind that surface level increase, women's individual pay fell. And expanding on that and providing a more robust explanation for why this might be the case, we can turn to other sources of data which show that women's individual pay was more likely to decrease than men's in resettlement. Women, for example, were more likely to work in the eviction zone prior to eviction, and as a result, on resettlement, had to relocate both their homes and their jobs. Men, on the other hand, were more likely to work outside the zone, so ultimately were relocating only their homes. Women also were more likely to work in petty trading, which is very reliant on dense social networks, so was much more prone to disruption upon resettlement. And these factors, the location and the nature of women's pre-eviction work, appears to have been the reason why women's individual pay fell. And just to give you a sense of women's sentiments around post-eviction work, to live in a new settlement is very difficult. The business is not doing good at my new home because people need to know and understand me. Again, pointing to the dense social networks involved in women's pre-eviction work. And to cope with the new environment was a great challenge because I had no people who knew me. People move from one settlement to another, and this affects our family economically. So in terms of the second question, just to conclude briefly, the majority of evictees reported improved post-eviction housing outcomes, and most adverse outcomes were in the area of employment. Secondly, participation in the TFUP movement was significantly associated with negative employment outcomes for post-eviction owners, and the narratives of resettlement coming out of interviews suggest that this was due to the expectations of members, and their resettlement strategies. And finally, women were particularly at risk in this eviction and resettlement because of the nature and location of their pre-eviction work. Now, in terms of policy implications from the second question, the first, and perhaps most clear, is that it's important to focus on post-eviction jobs and employment, as well as housing. And this is a realization that has also come out of other research on resettlement in other contexts, rural contexts, for example, urban context in North America, that employment is often underappreciated. And that's emphasized here as well in a slightly different context. Also, to ensure that participation in mobilization around evictions doesn't actually hinder individual efforts to secure post-eviction opportunities. Thirdly, to ensure that mobilization accurately reflects the risks on the ground. And it appears that when mobilization is targeted at other risks, people can ultimately end up being very much exposed to real risks as they exist on the ground. And finally, to focus also on women's jobs and pay, and particularly on the social network dimensions of women's employment, which here was particularly important in determining the outcomes for women. And the fact also, I think one thing that makes this particularly challenging is that women's post-eviction individual pay decreases were hidden behind an overall increase in household income, which makes women particularly susceptible in this case. So before I take questions, and I'd love to have as many questions as possible, I'd like to give a few acknowledgements to people without whom this work would have been impossible. And first and foremost is to members of the TFUP movement and residents of Kurasini who were incredibly generous in welcoming me into their community. And I owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. Secondly is to, I haven't included it here, to Ken Mason, who, one of the original settlers of Kenya, who just brought an enthusiasm for the politics of East Africa to me at an early age. And without him, I probably wouldn't have pursued East Africa as a place of study, but just really captured his passion for East African politics. And I think it's just a fascinating issue, and I have to thank him for instilling that in me. Leonard Ortolano, my wonderful supervisor. Can't say enough good things about Len. And I'm not trying to butter you up for later. And
I really don't want you to leave.
And also, my committee and committee chair, Doug McAdam, David Abernathy, Jeremy Weinstein, joining us online, and Nicole Ardoin, my chair. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions, receive any comments, suggestions you might have. Thank you. I might just take a sip. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So your original question, the first one you presented, focused a lot on this owner-renter dynamic, and it struck me that it really paralleled a lot of the findings of Hernando de Soto, talking about the political capital that one gets of ownership. I mean, do you see this as kind of reinforcing that type of work on a sort of parallel ground, that ultimately it's one of the most critical things we could do for development is to take people in these sorts of informal situations and give them access to capital in that way?
Well, that's a really interesting question for a number of reasons. And I think perhaps the biggest reason is that it's hard to disentangle in this case sort of the payoffs that are attributed to owners, the sort of more rational and calculative behaviors that dominated owner thinking, and also these sort of more psychosocial processes, which seem to be very closely tied up with those more economic aspects. So for example, connection to place, belief in efficacy of action. And what's so interesting is that almost all three of these things almost always flow together in the case of owners. And it's very intriguing, and I think one interesting topic for future research would be to find a place where perhaps payoffs don't work in owners' benefit, but they still have perhaps, and it would be, you have to test this first, but to see that if they have that belief in efficacy of action and connection to place, and see, do those more psychosocial aspects of ownerhood still motivate participation of owners to engage in collective action, where maybe the more rational, calculative payoffs don't dominate, but it's actually hard to find a place where all three don't go together, which I guess is one of the reasons why there is that huge divide between owners and renters. In virtually all cases, the odds are stacked, both sort of rationally, calculatively for owners, and more psychosocially. And it is hard to tweeze those apart, but it seems like, I guess, you know, in terms of whether those more psychosocial processes just fall domino-like after becoming an owner, or whether there is a more sort of long-term development of ownerhood is a little unclear. And it's something I'd like to tweeze apart, but it is interesting that those factors both the sort of more economic factors and psychosocial factors seem to flow together. So I don't know if it's possible to say, you know, capital just leads, but clearly ownerhood just provides tremendous advantages in this case.
Can you give a little bit more of a description of who were the TFUP members?
Absolutely.
And what their maybe their household income was, and,
Totally.
and then what the difference between owners and renters are in household income?
Well, and this actually touches on Jeremy's question, because what's so fascinating is many of the perceived differences between owners and renters are just that, they're perceived perceived differences. So for example, people talk about, oh, owners are richer. Actually, they're not. There's no significant difference in income between owners and renters. And the average income for members is $2.74 a day. So poor by any standard. But no difference really in income in terms of owners and renters. The other sort of attribute attributed to renters is transience. Now, it is true that owners have lived for longer in their community than renters, but the difference isn't as vast as you'd expect, given this sort of huge psychosocial divide between the two groups. You know, renters just referring to their valuelessness, their transience. But when you actually look at the data, live there on average 15 years, you know, 13 to 15 years, and owners have lived there for on the order of 21 years. But it's not like, you know, 15 years is not really that transient. So there is a difference, but the difference as it manifests itself is much larger than the actual numeric difference. And that sort of touches on Jeremy's question in that there are divisions between owners and renters, but the actual physical divide is much less than the sort of perceived psychological and behavioral divide.
And then in the TFUP, what's the composition amongst owners and renters?
It's about 60% renters, 40% owners. Yeah. And it's 50% Muslim, 50% Christian, and wildly ethnically diverse. Just as an aside, just to give a sense of the makeup, then this is intriguing, interviewed 102 individuals. In the first 24 individuals, I had no overlaps of ethnicity. The first 24 individuals, every single person was of a different ethnicity. So it really is a phenomenally diverse community. And that is quite normal, I think, in Tanzania. But you often hear that it's diverse, but you don't have a quantification of that. But when you're actually looking at your thing, you're like, my God. It really is very diverse.
Sorry, one more really quick.
Yeah, of course.
How do you find those 64 people again?
Well, so I actually had a pool of 102 interviewees, and then from that I interviewed all those who were evicted in the first wave. And that broke down. I interviewed all the members who were evicted, and then what I did is actually added some more individuals to make sure I had enough non-members who were evicted, and those were selected randomly. It's a little complicated because I have sort of multiple tiered pools of interviewees, but effectively I interviewed all the members that I'd initially interviewed who had been evicted in the first wave. And in terms of, right. Well, that's a good question. I was in communication with slum dweller groups in East Africa, Southern Africa, and South Asia. And I was thinking of studying organizing in a more abstract sense. But one fortuitous outcome was that just before I was about to embark on field work, the Tanzanian group, which is the most recent and a very formative branch of the sort of international slum organizing community, got in touch with me and said, we're actually going to have an eviction taking place. And I thought, well, as interesting as it would be to study organizing in the abstract, I could look at this in a more tangible sense and also potentially do something of value to the organizers themselves and the community themselves, because you can actually study to what extent their mobilization is successful or not, and that could be helpful for them as well.
Very interesting work. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks, Crystal.
I was really struck by the before and after, and especially along gender lines.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you validated any of the results that you were being told on the after side, and if there might be different gender biases, if maybe men don't want to say that they now earn less, especially towards the warner or something.
That's possible. But I think, and certainly when you look at the quantitative data, I think there's a couple of reasons to maybe wonder about the robustness of the quantitative data alone. But I think when you combine it with that much more robust, quite frankly, in this sense with the N that I had, narrative accountings of evictees, you start to get a real sense for why those results would be borne out on the ground. Now, the exact numeric dimensions of those changes, I think we could probably question. But the the direction of them, given that much more detailed accounting by evictees for why women's pay would have fallen, why men's pay wouldn't have fallen by both men and women, I think gives a lot more confidence that that is something that does exist. But I think you're also right that, the numbers could be fudged, and I think, the exact percentages of change, I think, could be questioned. And certainly with an N that's relatively small, I think that's always a possibility. But that's why I really like and strove to combine the quantitative data with that much more nuanced qualitative material.
Did you mention the Biashara for the women? Because that might...
Yes. Oh, yeah, and that a real hinge point was that the nature of women's occupation. And people had very complex and detailed accountings for why women's pay would have fallen, given the nature of their work, how social network dependent it was, and also the fact that it had very different pre-eviction locations than the work of men. Oh, let Nicole actually, sorry.
Well, I just sort of getting away from these very technical
Totally,
questions.
totally.
I was just wondering, since your results were sort of surprising and contrary to what
Yeah.
theory predicted, what you learned affected your future path, and what I don't know what your original motivations were. Maybe you talk about that, but then also how finding all this out changed what you want to do next in your career.
Well, thanks. That's a very interesting question, because I think when I approached, like maybe many people who are just instinctively interested in mobilization, I probably approached it with a bit of rose-colored glasses, thinking, look at the tremendous potential of and opportunity offered by grassroots mobilization. But what I came away with was that it's much more complicated than you'd expect, and potentially much more interesting. And I think one thing for future work is that there isn't a lot of research on, relatively speaking, on unsuccessful, I don't want to maybe denigrate their attempts, but on ultimately relatively unsuccessful mobilization efforts, or certainly counterintuitive and surprising outcomes in terms of mobilization. And that's certainly led me to want to explore the dynamics of mobilization and, frankly, unsuccessful mobilizations in further detail.
So academically or sort of in a non-governmental role?
Academically. I mean, in terms of my more academic path after this, I would love to look at it in a more sort of scholarly fashion, but I think also I'm very interested in combining, work on the ground with scholarship, and I would like to engage with. The satisfying thing about this group is that it was quite formative. It's the newest member of this global movement, and I think working with them was incredibly satisfying, and I think combining sort of a more scholarly role with engaging with grassroots practitioners, I think is, for my own particular bias, is incredibly satisfying, and I'd like to continue that. Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry, Kara, sorry.
For the second question, how much did whether they really engaged and participated in the numerator change their perceptions about the organization and the organization's ability to build houses against them?
Well, you touched on an interesting thing, because I used two different measures of participation in the two halves, and the reason is I was looking at two very different concepts, both ultimately related to participation. In the first, I was looking at participation in costly social movement activities, for which participation as an enumerator serves as a good measure. In the second, I was looking at participation-derived social capital, which is not so much maybe about, as mentioned, the definition of social capital and those seminal definitions are much more about social networks, so much more about sort of the depth of engagement in a movement rather than the cost of a type of engagement. So for that, the measure in the second half was actually just duration of participations, because it's expected that the sort of social network benefits of participation that yield that social capital accrue over time. And that's why I used the duration of membership. So there's slightly different measures in the two halves.
That participation would be in the group that wasn't in the
Well, what's so intriguing is that who didn't participate as a numerator were renters. And renters who were members pursued a very similar course as owners who were members. They also believed that, for example, the movement would provide housing. They deferred their individual searches. But for renters, the consequences were less damaging because they ultimately didn't really relocate very far from their former home. So a relatively far location site for a post-eviction renter maybe it was the difference between 1.8 kilometers away from their former home and 1.2 kilometers. So yes, they relocated further away, but it didn't have those.
It wasn't from the perception.
Exactly. Whereas for an owner, it's intriguing because in a way they have these advantages that Jeremy alluded to in many respects. But when an owner decided to defer their individual search, was relegated to a relatively far spot for a post-eviction owner, they ended up very far indeed from their former homes. And that's where, even though they still reported improved housing, they saw these tremendous spin-off in terms of negative employment outcomes. So there is still this very strong owner-renter divide, although my measure in this case is duration of membership.
We have time for one last question. I know at the end there you can ask me.
Just given what you said about the actual equality between renters and owners, why do you think you didn't see more owners becoming renters post-eviction?
That's, sorry, the equality or inequality?
Well, yeah, just you were saying in actuality they were more equal.
Well, it's only in terms of income,
Oh,
but not in terms of
That's-
total assets, because you have a house or you don't have a house, so your assets are different.
You've touched on a fascinating point. Yes, in terms of assets or capital, financial capital, they were relatively equal. There was certainly no significant difference between the two. But there is this, despite that, there is this tremendous divide in perception of what it means to be a renter. Being a renter entails lack of opportunity, helplessness, and desperation, which is, those supplementary interviewees argue, is why they just latch on to the movement identity but don't participate. Whereas ownerhood, even though in terms of income is not different than renterhood, it entails a very different sense of one's, particularly efficacy of action. Owners believe they can achieve things, renters do not. And in the dissertation I delve into this in some more detail, relying on an extension on Hirschman's theory, which really seeks to explain what happens to individuals who can't pursue voice, or voice is very costly, like for renters here. But exit is also costly. You can't really, the slum dweller setting, it's very difficult to exit a slum. If you could exit slums, you would have done it long ago. So really the question for renters is, what happens when voice is too costly to pursue and exit is unavailable? And there's this theoretical extension to Hirschman's body of work, which says that, and develops this in incredible mathematical detail, but it's a really interesting piece of research actually by a fellow named Tung. And he says that the result of that is a sense of just deep resignation and helplessness. And actually refers to this, it's just a very interesting extension, but I think it does accurately capture what is going on in terms of renterhood. Exit is unavailable in this scenario. You can't really exit the slum setting. It's an imposed situation by a government. And also voice is very costly for renters. So I think both in empirical and theoretical terms, the outcome is a sense of helplessness. And it certainly comes through in the narrative material. There's just so many quotes. I couldn't provide them all, but it's stunning. Just quote after quote from renters. Renters mean, first when you see the quote, you think this must be from an owner. But it's a renter saying, renters are meaningless. Renters are worthless. And the amount of language around worthlessness and helplessness is just palpable. So this again goes back to Jeremy's original question about what does it mean to be an owner or a renter? And there are intense psychological factors going on as well.
Thank you for a fascinating
Thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.